When Montgomery's amateurs line reached Washington, it turned the tide. Those words sound like a rumor from a mess tent. But in January 1945, they became an alliance-level crisis, one that threatened to break the Allied command structure at the very moment Hitler's last great gamble in the West was collapsing. It is 7 January 1945, and deep in Belgium, at Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery's headquarters near Zonhoven, war correspondents crowd into a makeshift briefing room. Outside, the ground is iron-hard with frost. The Ardennes is still burning. And the U.S. Army, specifically 1st U.S. Army and 9th U.S. Army, temporarily placed under Montgomery's 21st Army Group since 20 December 1944, has just endured the bloodiest crisis it has yet faced in Europe. Montgomery steps forward to speak. He means to explain, to reassure, to shape the narrative. Little did he know that what happened next would become legendary, for the wrong reasons. Because within hours, across the Atlantic in Washington, men who controlled American manpower, money, and morale would read headlines suggesting the U.S. Army had been saved by a British field marshal, and that American generals were, implicitly or explicitly, amateurs. And that outrage would trigger a chain reaction that did not just wound pride. It reshaped command politics, forced a public political intervention by Winston Churchill, and helped harden the Allied leadership into the unified machine that would smash into Germany weeks later. This is the story of the remark, the backlash, and the moment the alliance nearly tore itself apart, until the response turned the tide. By the winter of 1944, the Western Allies had already done what many believed impossible. After the landings in Normandy, the breakout at Saint-Lô, the encirclement at Falaise, and the lightning pursuit across France, they stood on Germany's doorstep. But the war did not end. Instead, the front froze, literally and operationally. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles. The Siegfried Line and the terrible fighting in places like the Huichen Forest consumed men and ammunition. By early December, American infantry divisions along quiet sectors were thin, tired, and in places dangerously overextended. That quiet sector was the Ardennes, a region of steep ridges, dense forests, narrow roads, and villages that clung to the valleys like stone anchors. In Allied planning, the Ardennes was considered unsuitable for a major German armored offensive. So U.S. formations, some newly arrived, some refitting, held long frontages there. Then Hitler struck. On 16 December 1944, German forces launched their last Great Western Offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, and to the Germans as Wacht am Rhein. The primary armored weight included Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army in the north and Hasso von Manteufel's 5th Panzer Army in the center. The weather helped them. Fog, snow, and low cloud grounded Allied tactical air power. In the first days, U.S. units were smashed, surrounded, or forced into desperate fighting withdrawals. The crisis quickly became a command and control nightmare. General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group suddenly found that 1st U.S. Army's headquarters and communications were positioned awkwardly relative to the Bulge, while the German penetration threatened to cut lines and isolate forces. Eisenhower needed someone to hold the north shoulder and keep the Germans from swinging northwest toward the Meuse and beyond. So on 20 December 1944, Eisenhower took a decision that was militarily practical and politically explosive. He placed the U.S. First Army and U.S. Ninth Army under Montgomery's 21st Army Group for the duration of the emergency. It was not an insult. It was a communications fix, a geographic necessity, and a bid to impose unity north of the Bulge while Bradley directed the southern shoulder and Patton's counterstroke. But the optics were dangerous. A British field marshal commanding major American armies in the biggest U.S. battle of the European War. Now add one more ingredient: Montgomery's personality. Montgomery was brilliant, methodical, and intensely confident. He was also, in victory, famously unbearable. He believed morale was a weapon, and he understood the press. But he underestimated something even more powerful than German armor. He underestimated American pride. To understand why one remark could detonate across an ocean, we have to feel how raw the Ardennes still was when Montgomery stepped in front of reporters. For the American rifleman in a foxhole near Elsenborn Ridge, the battle was not a chessboard. It was survival. The cold was not a background detail, it was an enemy. The bitter Ardennes winter froze hands to rifle stocks. Lubricants thickened. Batteries died. Wounded men who could not be evacuated risked freezing where they lay. And then there was the sound, the dull, rolling concussion of German artillery, crack of rifle fire echoing through trees, the sudden metallic roar of tracked vehicles grinding down icy roads. By 600 hours on 16 December, German artillery opened with a storm that many U.S. veterans later compared to the worst bombardments of 1918. By 900 hours, German infantry were moving through the mist, probing weak points, bypassing strongpoints, infiltrating forests. By 1400 hours, some American units were already fractured, companies fighting as isolated pockets, officers trying to form ad hoc lines with cooks, clerks, and stragglers. In the east, whole regiments of the 106th Infantry Division were caught in the Schnee Eifel and would suffer a disaster measured in thousands of prisoners. 697 listed as POW in divisional totals. To the north, the Germans threw weight at road junctions and ridge lines. St. Vith became critical because it controlled routes needed for the German timetable. Every hour gained by the Americans, there was an hour stolen from Hitler's plan. And in that northern sector, the Americans fought with stubborn discipline, often with small unit leadership holding when higher-level communications failed. The German plan depended on speed and fuel. Their spearheads needed to burst west before Allied reserves could respond, but the terrain choked them. Roads bottlenecked, bridges slowed armor, and when the weather cleared, Allied air power would return like a hammer from the sky. But in those first days, the threat was terrifyingly real. German forces committed major armored power, including heavy tanks and assault guns, and aggressive Kampfgruppen thrusting toward crossings and depots. The Allies, caught off balance, had to improvise. Eisenhower's headquarters at SHAEF took stock. By 19 December, the bulge was widening. Some American command posts were nearly blind. Reports were contradictory. Rumors moved faster than verified intelligence. Fear gripped the staff officers as much as the men in the snow. On 20 December, Eisenhower acted, splitting the battle into North and South, giving Bradley the South and Montgomery the North. Montgomery moved quickly, but in his own style, cautious, deliberate, order-driven. He concentrated forces, organized a defensive shield, and stabilized the northern shoulder. He brought elements like XXX Corps into readiness to hold the Meuse line if needed. He coordinated with American commanders now under his temporary command. From Montgomery's perspective, it was a textbook emergency. Stop the enemy, restore coherence, then counterattack. From the American perspective, especially among senior leaders like Bradley, the very fact that their armies were temporarily under British command was humiliating, even if necessary. And as the days passed, another battlefield opened, one made of paper, ink, and headlines. Because while the Americans fought to encircle the Bulge and restore the front, Journalists were already preparing to tell the world who had saved whom. By late December, the Germans were stalling. Their fuel shortages became crippling. Their offensive timetable collapsed. The clear weather returned, and Allied air forces punished exposed columns. The battle would last until 25 January 1945, and by then the Americans would have suffered roughly 80,000 plus casualties, with about 19,000 killed, tens of thousands wounded, and thousands missing or captured. German losses ran 80,000 to 100,000, a blow they could not replace. Source. But on 7 January, the battle was not history yet. It was still fresh blood and fresh grief. And Montgomery walked into that briefing room. Some accounts note he described the battle as most interesting, one of the most interesting and tricky battles he had ever handled. Source. On its own, that might have sounded like a professional compliment to the complexity of war. But to families reading telegrams, to wounded men in field hospitals, interesting sounded cold, detached, almost clinical. Then came the most incendiary part, the framing. Montgomery's message, as it was received in American circles, was that he had arrived, imposed order, and handled the battle, while American generals had fumbled it. In the storm of interpretation, a line took form that Washington could not ignore. The suggestion that Americans were amateurs and that Britain had to wipe their noses. Whether spoken publicly in precisely those words or whispered in private correspondence, the effect in America was the same. It landed like a slap. And once it hit the American press, it became a political weapon. By the time the story reached the United States, it was no longer a press conference. It was a crisis. In Washington, the war was not just fought with divisions and bombers. It was fought with appropriations, congressional confidence, and public trust. Every headline mattered. Every perceived insult mattered. Imagine the scene. American families had endured Pearl Harbor, North Africa, Sicily, Normandy. Now their sons were freezing in Belgium and Luxembourg. Telegrams arrived. Gold stars appeared in windows, and then the newspapers carried the implication that those sons had been saved by a British commander because American leadership was incompetent. Fear gripped the Allied leadership, not fear of German tanks this time, but fear that the coalition itself might fracture. At SHAEF, Eisenhower understood exactly what was happening. He had built his entire command philosophy around managing egos, nations, and competing ambitions. His genius was not just strategic, it was political. But this time, the fire was too big to smother quietly. American commanders reacted with fury. General Omar Bradley, whose reputation was built on quiet competence and loyalty, took it personally, not because his pride was fragile, but because the insinuation struck at the credibility of the entire U.S. Army command system. Patton, already famous for his sharp tongue, did not need additional fuel. The idea that Montgomery would claim credit while American formations bled for weeks lit a fuse that had been waiting since Sicily. And at the center of it all stood Eisenhower, who now had to choose between two imperatives. Maintain Allied unity, especially with Britain, whose forces anchored the Northern Front and whose government was a co-equal partner in the alliance. Or defend American morale and legitimacy, because without it, there would be no political backing to continue the war as planned. The crisis had multiple layers. Command legitimacy. Montgomery was already controversial for the broad front versus single thrust debate. This incident risked making him appear not as a partner, but as a rival. Morale. The U.S. Army had taken the worst blow of its European campaign and recovered. To have that recovery framed as British salvation could undermine the confidence of troops and citizens alike. Alliance politics. The British needed American power. The Americans needed British cooperation and bases, but not at the cost of public humiliation. The tension climbed day by day. By early January, as the Bulge began to shrink and the Allies prepared their next offensives toward the Rhine, the political temperature rose fast. Washington was angry. London was alarmed. And in the middle stood Churchill. Churchill understood the American psyche and the American press. He knew morale was a weapon, and he knew that an insult, real or perceived, could cost Britain far more than a division could. If the Americans concluded that Britain's senior field marshal was undermining U.S. prestige, Congress could become hostile. War allocations could become contentious. The special relationship could sour at the worst possible time. Now the war had two fronts. One against Germany, one inside the alliance. And for Eisenhower, this was the moment everything seemed lost, not on the battlefield, but at the command table. Because if he could not restore trust, he risked losing the only thing that made Allied victory possible, a functioning coalition. The turning point did not come from a battlefield maneuver. It came from discipline, political discipline and narrative discipline. Eisenhower, faced with a rupture, did what great coalition commanders do. He forced a decision. He would not allow the alliance to drift into bitterness. He would not allow a press-driven scandal to determine military leadership. And he would not allow American morale to be compromised while the U.S. Army was still fighting and dying in Europe. Behind closed doors, the message was unmistakable. Montgomery had to stop feeding the controversy, and he had to repair the damage. Meanwhile, Churchill prepared a public counteroffensive, not against Eisenhower, not against Bradley, and certainly not against the U.S. Army, but against the impression that Britain believed America needed rescuing. On 18 January 1945, Churchill addressed the matter in Parliament, praising the Americans and emphasizing Allied unity. The point was not to win an argument. The point was to put a political seal over a military alliance, so the war could continue without poison in its bloodstream. Source: this was not just rhetoric, it was strategy. Churchill's intervention told Washington, Britain does not claim this victory at America's expense. Britain respects the U.S. Army. Britain understands the human cost. And it told Montgomery, publicly, unmistakably, that if Britain wanted to win the war, it could not afford victory in the press at the expense of its most powerful ally. At SHAEF, the CR, ISIS also forced a hard lesson into the Allied command culture. Never again would they allow internal rivalry to eclipse the fact that American armies were bearing the main weight of ground combat in the West. The alliance, stung by embarrassment, became more disciplined. And that discipline mattered, because the next phase of the war was not a pursuit across France. It was a deliberate, grinding assault into Germany's prepared defenses. Within weeks, Allied armies would launch major operations in the Rhineland. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would prepare for immense set-piece offensives, operations whose success depended on cooperation between British, Canadian, and American forces, and on synchronized logistics and timing. We see this tightening of Allied coordination in early 1945, operations like Operation Veritable, the northern arm of the push into the Rhineland beginning 8 February 1945. And the American arm, Operation Grenade, whose crossing of the Roer would be delayed by the flooding caused when the Germans opened and damaged the Roer dams. These operations demanded unity. They demanded trust. They demanded that commanders focus forward, not sideways. So in a bitter irony, Montgomery's amateur's scandal, by nearly wrecking the alliance, helped harden it. It forced Eisenhower and Churchill to draw clear boundaries about public messaging and coalition respect. It reminded every commander that ego could be as dangerous as enemy armor. And it ensured that when the final drive into Germany came, the alliance moved with sharper political cohesion. That is how the tide turned, not only against Hitler, but against the internal fractures that could have slowed the Allied war machine. By late January 1945, the Bulge had been erased. The front lines were largely restored. The German gamble had failed. In human cost, it was devastating. American forces suffered well over 80,000 casualties in the campaign, including around 19,000 killed, making it the largest and deadliest battle fought by the U.S. Army in the European theater. German losses of 80,000 to 100,000 bled the Wehrmacht white in the West, particularly its armored reserves. Montgomery's role on the northern shoulder was real, and in military terms, the temporary command arrangement helped impose coherence at a moment when communications and geography made it necessary. The historical record acknowledges that 1st and Ninth Armies were indeed placed under 21st Army Group during the emergency. But the legacy of the episode was not purely tactical. It became a case study in coalition warfare. How words can wound alliances, how press narratives can become weapons, and how political leadership must sometimes intervene to protect military unity. Churchill's public emphasis on Allied solidarity was not just statesmanship, it was operational necessity. And for Eisenhower, the lesson would echo beyond 1945. Command is not only the movement of armies, it is the management of human pride, national honor, and public belief. In the end, the scandal did not split the alliance. It disciplined it. It tightened it. And it helped ensure that in the final months of the war, through the Rhineland, across the Rhine, and into the heart of Germany, the Western Allies would fight as one coalition, not as competing national legends. In war, generals fight battles, but alliances fight wars, and sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the tank in the forest, it is the sentence that turns friends into rivals. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Frontlines as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.